Welcome to Social Science Matters, a podcast series from the HIFNB with Kim.
And Jan. This is dedicated to exploring the important world of social science research in the marine environment.
Welcome on board.
Okay, welcome everybody to the second episode of Social Science Matters, How to Start Thinking About Social Worlds, the philosophy episode. So in this episode, we'll shift our focus on how to start thinking about social worlds. Hi, Kim.
Hi, Jan. It's nice to be back for episode 2.
Definitely. Thank you for coming again. So let's talk about questioning assumptions.
Yes. I think much social science research, we talked about this a little bit in our previous episode, that social science research is not about the communication necessarily of natural science research. It's about the study of social worlds. So science communication may be one part of that, where we understand how we can best communicate with a variety of different segments of society. And so really at the heart of a lot of social science research is about, it's thinking about the world, but it's also about challenging our assumptions about that social world. Oftentimes, how we understand the world is shaped by how we've been taught to think about it. So how we think about the world and how we look at it is often shaped by how we've been taught to think and look at the world.
Makes sense, yeah.
And so social science research is often about unpacking some of those assumptions to actually think about what is actually going on here, what is shaping why things are happening as they are happening. So breaking down some of those assumptions, we might assume that particular actors in the marine environment act in a certain way, but that might not actually be the case. What values do they hold? Thinking about some of the research that you described in episode 1.
Yeah.
Why do, as a PhD student in my group, solely, and you can also listen to one of her podcasts in the...
episode, I don't know, 14 or
Yeah,
something? I don't know.
in our other podcast series that Jan hosts. And she thinks about what are the emotional dimensions by which people come to care about the ocean. And so we might think we know what those are, but social science allows us to dig a little bit and find out more about those. In terms of questioning assumptions, again, an important thing to say at the start of this podcast about when we start to think about social worlds, and this episode is also about how do we begin to do research that might involve human societies and might focus on people, is also about thinking a little bit about who you are listening to this podcast. Are you already a social scientist? Are you a natural scientist of different types? You know, are you a geochemist or an ecologist or a biologist or a mix of different ones? And one start point is also to ask: are you the best person to be doing the research that you might want to do?
Oh, yeah.
So that's a big assumption that we should be asking right at the beginning of our research.
Yep.
I am not the best social scientist to do every type of research in social science. As I mentioned, I am a governance person. I am a geographer. I am trained predominantly in qualitative methods, although I've had quantitative methods training. I mainly use qualitative methods. So I'm not going to be the perfect fit for every project, or even every project that I might want to run a very large project, but I'm not going to be the expert on every social science dimension of it. So one important question that we have to ask right at the beginning is, do we need to engage different people to come onto the project that we're interested in? So I would certainly say natural science projects that are thinking about a human dimension to them should probably ask, do we actually need a social scientist on this project? Would that be really useful? And very early on, have those conversations with people and say, okay, well, who would be the right kind of social scientist? Do we need an anthropologist? Or actually, this seems to be more cultural. So do we need actually a humanities person? Do we need someone who is a geographer? Do we need someone who's a sociologist? And so on. If it is suitable for someone within one of the natural science disciplines to be doing this, what kinds of training might they require? So those kinds of questions and those kinds of assumptions are really important right at that start point of what is it that you want to explore about the social world and who is best placed to do it. And early on saying, if it's not you, how do you bring that specialism on board? How do you bring that expertise on board? And how do you engage the right type of people to do that? So that's really, really important, I think, right at the beginning of any kind of project design when we start thinking about social worlds. It's about thinking, who can do this? Is it me? What kind of training do I need? Is it someone else? How can I get them on board?
Yeah. How long do you grapple with that question? Like,
well, I mean, for many of us, we're designing research within our own research areas and comfort zones.
Yeah.
That would be fair to say. A lot of my projects, when I've done work on, for example, global shipping routes, I do tend to use methods that fall within my own area of expertise. But as research diversifies, we were talking in the last episode about the importance of some questions about the marine environment require us to take on board different perspectives.
Yeah.
A good example of this would be, I'm interested in shipping, as you may have gathered. Shipping is something ship routing is something that I'm very interested in. And actually, there are some questions about ship routing that I can't answer, such as, where do these ships even go and what's their frequency? And that really requires some modelling and data-driven approaches and big data-driven approaches, where we might use something called AIS data, so automatic identification systems. So these are systems that are actually required on ships that are above 300 gross tons. So the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, requires ships to have those transmitters on. They transmit certain global positioning data of where ships are. Now, I'm not trained in how to use that data, even though it would be useful for me then to ask the kinds of questions that I would ask about shipping and ship routing. So that's where I might think, oh, okay, it'd be really good to have an AIS expert. And one of our colleagues here, Ola, who's doing a PhD, he might be a good person to ask, to say, okay, well, you have that expertise. If we're going to ask this particular question, you'd be a great person to bring on board. So oftentimes, yes, we are working within our research comfort zones, where we will be the people who are trained to do the research that we want to do. But as the marine environment is complex, the questions we ask about it may be complex. We know that research funders are also funding projects that are requiring different expertise to come together. If you're leading one of those projects, it's about asking, well, who might we involve on that project? Do we need a social scientist? I would say to anyone who's grappling with that question, ask yourself, what kind of social scientist do you need?
Yeah, exactly.
What kind of expertise do you need? What expert area? Do you need someone who's an expert in science communication? Do you need someone who's an expert in stakeholder engagement? Do you need someone who's an expert in secondary policy analysis? Do you need someone who can do big data-driven analysis of certain trends? So ask those questions right at the beginning. Yeah,
exactly. So it's a lot about valuing different knowledges, I guess, and
yeah, I mean, there's valuing the knowledges of different scientific disciplines and bringing those into a project, but also social science. It's a great question, Jan, actually. When we start to think about our engagement with the social world, we have to understand that the social worlds are known differently. They're experienced differently. Yeah. So an example I often use in the classroom, Jan, which I think can maybe be helpful. Our listeners will tell me otherwise in any feedback. But we all know and come to understand our world differently. So, Jan, you and I sat here in Oldenburg this morning in northwest Germany. And my Oldenburg is not your Oldenburg. Yeah. We are living in the same place. Oldenburg has a set of, and I'll come back to this example later, has a set of attributes to it. Certain landscape, flora and fauna, a certain number of population, a political party that's in charge. These are things that we know about Oldenburg. But there are other ways of knowing that are different. The way we actually come to experience the place that we're in. So how I know Oldenburg, how I might navigate it, and how you might know it and navigate it will be quite different. So my Oldenburg is not your Oldenburg, and your Oldenburg is not my Oldenburg. So we come to know the world differently. And this is social science. When we start thinking about social worlds, we have to understand that different people see the world differently. They see the world differently, but they also experience the world differently. And one thing in social science is to also be thinking at the start of a project, what is it that you want to know? So which people might you want to engage in trying to understand that problem? So if you want to understand coastal change, you might have to engage people who know about that process, or might live there or might have that insight. And then you might want to actually think, well, I want to engage lots of different knowledges about that coast. I might want to think about, well, how do fishing communities engage it? How do leisure users engage it? How do big industry engage that area if they want to put some form of offshore energy in place? So they will all know this environment differently and understand it differently. So social science is also about unpacking and exploring and valuing different knowledge systems about our world and getting to grips with those, because that's, again, what helps us to understand what's going on in the marine world. Why is it changing in the world in the way it is? Because if some users have a certain knowledge about the sea, which is it can be used as a space of resource extraction. That's how I know it. That's how I understand it. It is a space that is ripe for exploitation. That's how they'll come to use it. Other people may know it in a different way, in a way that's deeply emotional, it's connected to their life world, and that's what might drive them to protect it.
Yeah.
And so on the one hand, there's different knowledges, but there's also different knowledge systems that also drive how we can think through a social science lens. So, there are some types of knowledges. We talked about this in the last episode. There's objective knowledge, which gives us kind of generalized ways of knowing the world. There are more subjective or embodied forms of knowledge that are about experience, the things I was just talking about. But there's also different types of knowledge systems that are important. Many knowledge systems that inform governance are driven by Western thinking that comes from the Enlightenment. There's lots that you can read and learn about this, certain ways of knowing the world and understanding the world. But there are also knowledge systems that are indigenous, with a capital I, and that's very important in terms of indigenous knowledge. And those ways of thinking about our world are quite different, or I wouldn't say different. They sit alongside, say, for example, Western ways of thinking of the world. There's a wonderful paper by two scholars in Canada, George and Weber, and they talk about these different knowledge systems really beautifully. And I'll make sure this is in the resources.
Yeah. Thanks.
And they say that Western knowledge oftentimes sees the sea as a resource. So I'm using their words here. They see it as a resource, something that we can use and engage, something that we can take fish stocks from, energy from, something that we can take deep sea mineral resources from. It is a resource. Philip Steinberg, who's an academic who writes about the ocean from Durham University, he says that the sea's also been seen as a resource for routes, for shipping. So we actually see it as somewhere, a space we can traverse.
Yeah, interesting.
So the sea is a resource. Often in the Western imaginary, we see the sea as a resource. And George and Weber say, actually, other ways of knowing see the sea as a force, not a resource, but a force. That there is no separation between land and sea, but the sea is part of us. And that's very different to seeing it as something that's separate to us, that we can extract things from, a resource, but rather a force that we're entangled with and entwined with. And this is very important. There is not one indigenous knowledge. There are many indigenous knowledges. They are different. They're very place specific. Canadian scholarship, indigenous scholarship about the ocean is very different to Pacific Island. And even between the Pacific Islands, there are differences in the ways that oceans are known. But this idea that the ocean is also us. Haofa is a scholar from Hawaii, and he talks about we are the ocean. We are the ocean. So it's a force, not a resource. And that's a different knowledge system. So when we start thinking about ocean worlds, as we mentioned, you might want to think about who's doing the research about ocean worlds. How do we bring that different knowledge into it from researchers? But also, what kinds of knowledges are we interested in unpacking about the social worlds and social ocean worlds? And that might also mean working with indigenous scholars at times as well.
Absolutely.
So there has been some very good work on this around deep sea mining, or the prospect of deep sea mining around certain Pacific islands, where that has actually engaged indigenous scholars in doing that scholarship. And so, but then there's also, going back to the question of power, Jan, there's also a need to be careful around how different knowledges are understood and enrolled. It's really important that Western science doesn't subsume and claim other modes of knowing that come from indigenous ways of knowing, and that indigenous knowledge is not worked and exploited for Western gain. They're two different ways of knowing, and that's not to say that these things, the Rio 1992 Rio conference talked about the importance of indigenous knowledge. So, these are not new debates.
Yeah, exactly.
But at the same time, we have to be very, very careful that there isn't another form of exploitation and extraction happening by trying to incorporate indigenous knowledge into Western power systems, because that just simply, there's lots written on this.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. And so this was in part quite theoretical, but let's talk about the role of theory here. What, as this is the philosophical episode, what is the role of theory?
Yeah, thanks, Jan. And I should say, I think what's very important here is I am not the oracle of all knowledge in these podcasts. These are also coming from my own experience as a social scientist, particularly as a geographer working within the marine social sciences. So also what I'm saying here, there may be other social scientists who are listening to this saying, I would have done these podcasts differently. Yeah, quite possibly.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. So, what you're listening to here is also sort of my take and my perspective. But theory is something that I'm very interested in. I was talking to someone in my team who said, I read a paper you wrote, Kim, with a colleague called Wet Ontology. And I was a bit, there was a lot in that. Theory is something that I think is very important. And I don't think we can underplay the importance of theory. For this very reason, we are all using theory all of the time, whether we think we are or not.
Yeah.
Theory simply means it's a way in which we think. It's a way in which we understand the world. So theory is a framework through which we can understand a given phenomenon, in this case, social phenomenon. Theory helps us to work with that in a particular way. But most of us are using theory without even realizing that we're doing it. We're using it every day. We're literally, because every time that we interpret something, we're interpreting it within a framework of understanding that we've been taught, that we've learned since we were kids. So we're all actually using theory all the time. And there's a geographer called Pamela Shermer-Smith, and she says this. She says we're all using theory all of the time, whether we like it or not. So we can't avoid it. So actually, theory can be scary. But understanding that we're all using it all the time anyway actually makes it less scary.
Yeah.
Because, every time you read something and you've got an opinion on it, it's because you've been taught to think in that way about it. So you're using theory anyway. You might not know that you're doing it, but you are.
Yeah.
And that, I think, makes it less frightening. Theory should not be, in my opinion. So my colleague who read this paper, I kind of wanted to apologize for this paper because I sort of, don't be frightened by theory. Many times theory can be stuffy, it can be complex, it can come across as confusing, and that's when it's not helpful. Theory should be helpful. As I mentioned, theory is a framework for helping us to understand. That is what theory is at its heart. It should be a framework for helping us to interpret and make sense of the social worlds, the human societies, the people who we're working with. That's what theory should do.
Okay.
That's what it should help us to achieve. When theory becomes stuffy, when theory becomes something that we're being bogged down by it, it's not helping us to make sense of the thing we want to make sense of, then theory is not doing its work, in my opinion. So we're all using theory all of the time. So that's the thing to say as a start point for this. Are listeners ready for the next part of theory? Can we talk more about theory?
Yeah, let's.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, theory is a framework for understanding, and we all take these different philosophical or theoretical positions in our world. So I want to go back to that example we used earlier, Jan, of my Oldenburg and your Oldenburg, and they are actually different philosophical positions. So when we talk about Oldenburg, that I'm looking out the window right now, listeners. When we look at Oldenburg outside the window, as I mentioned, there is a certain philosophical position that would say that's what we call a realist position, that says that we can see and observe and therefore know Oldenburg because of its flora and fauna, because of its landscape, because of its population. All of those things mean that we can know Oldenburg. That is a realist position, what we would call a kind of a naturalist or a realist philosophical position. And some people will look outside the window, and that's the Oldenburg they'll see. They'll say, of course, that's what Oldenburg is. It's got 170,000 people. The government is constituted by these parties. It has apparently 2.7 bikes per person.
Does it?
Apparently, I think I read this the other day. Don't hold me to this statistic. And there are some people, that's how they will understand Oldenburg. Some people will take a different philosophical position when they look out of that window. For me, I don't see one Oldenburg that exists. When I look out the window, I don't see one Oldenburg that has one set of flora and fauna and one population and one. I look out. I think there's 170,000 Oldenburgs out that window because everyone experiences it differently, and we call that an anti-realist position. So, and that is a position that is based on subjective experience. So, going back to my point about we're all using theory all the time anyway, the minute you look out the window, you're using it. You just may not realize that you are. So it becomes a framework for understanding. Now, why do I use this example? Some social science studies will be trying to find out what the world is like out there. What is the number? What is the percentage of declining fish stocks? What is the species abundance? What is the situation out there in our ocean? How many different industries, how much money are they making by doing this? How many people have been, what percentage of sea space is are people being dispossessed of? They will look for those answers. Other social scientists will use a different framework and they will say, I'm not interested in the number, I'm not interested in the exact number of decline of the environment or what exactly is happening factually in that sense. What I'm interested in is, what does that mean for people and how has that changed their life worlds? Are they suffering? In what ways might they feel they're resisting the things that are happening to them? And that's a different set of questions. So how we look at the world determines the questions we ask about it, which then determines in turn the methods we use, which is of course where we're going later in the podcast series. So theory is a way of looking at the world. It's also a way of a framework for helping us understand the world. But there are different ways in which we look at the world. I've just covered two of them. But those lead us to fundamentally different social science questions, as you can see. And so that's why theory becomes quite important. And I wrote a textbook. This is not to plug my own book. I wrote a textbook a couple of years ago. And I believe it is the second or third chapter of my book that deals with theory. And it talks about this, I think, hopefully in quite plain language. And ultimately, how we look at the world, what we believe exists out in the world, helps to shape the kinds of questions that we ask about it, which will then shape the methods that we use about it. And then theory also gives us a framework for understanding then and interpreting what we find through those methods.
Wonderful. So with all this theory and the different theories, the different standpoints in mind, how do you then choose your research area as a social scientist?
I mean, that's a big question and it's a broad question. And, I think as with all scientists, different types of natural sciences, different types of social scientists, interdisciplinary scientists, to some degree, we're always driven in our research. We're either driven by intrigue or curiosity, the things that inspire us to study the things that we do. I remember when we were doing our podcast, Jan, and I remember you telling me about diving. And, how do you get interested in your research field? What drives you to care about the ocean, to want to research it, to be interested in it? So there's always this element of curiosity.
Definitely.
And Jennifer Johns and Richard Phillips have written a book all about fieldwork that will appear on the resources of later episodes. And they talk about this, how curiosity sort of matters to research. But I think, so that is always a start point for any of us that leads us to the things we're interested in. Other times we might be led by problems, something that we see where we're like, oh God, why is that happening? And that will drive both our curiosity, but also our desire to kind of understand a problem or to even want to understand it to make it better. We might also be driven to choose our research focus, of course, by a project that we work on. So sometimes it's not decided for us. Sometimes it will be decided by funders who will put out a call that we address because we have to keep ourselves in jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are different frameworks by which we might come to our research focus. But ultimately, where theory comes into our research focus is what often drives our research focus is how we come to look at the world and the kinds of things we're interested in exploring about it. So for me, I think I've always been very interested in how people come to know and understand their world.
Mm-hmm.
And that drives my approach to research and the kinds of questions I ask, and therefore the types of methods that I use. So going back to episode 1, I'm interested in, well, we seem to have a very good piece of regulation for invasive species,
Mm-hmm.
but why doesn't it work?
Yeah.
Right? So that curiosity drives me, that problem drives me. And then actually the way I look at the world, which is, well, okay, there's people involved in this, and I could do a survey, but I'm not really going to understand by doing that really why, that question, why is it not working? That means understanding people's life worlds, which means then using methods that help me address that, which would be in-depth interviewing,
Mm-hmm.
or other similar methods that allow us to get at that kind of meaning, subjective meaning. So that comes through looking at the world and understanding that the world is experienced differently by different people, which gets us back to knowledge and people knowing and experiencing the world in different ways.
Perfect. Thank you so much for tying this all back together.
No trouble.
So this is the end of episode 2. We'll see us again in episode 3, the more practical concerns and matters of ethics.
I look forward to it.
Same. Thank you.
Want to dive deeper? You can find resources for every episode in the show notes.
And please share your questions, thoughts, and experiences on social media using the hashtag #SocialScienceMatters.